So today we're here to talk a little bit about the design process, the forbidden crazy design process, and how development can be involved with that from the beginning and what we've encountered along our careers as moments that have worked, moments that haven't worked, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. We've got some good anecdotal stories to tell, and we're going to open it up for some Q&A towards the end of this. Probably talked about a half an hour. Cool. So first, I'm going to introduce our panel. It's Bridget and Tom. You guys want to talk a little about what you do first?
So I'm an interactive designer at Tonic Design. So basically, our creative department, even though we have segments of I'm an interactive designer, I'm a user experience designer, I'm strategy, we kind of like to wear all the hats. So I do visual design, sometimes user experience, kind of like introduced into that, copywriting, really anything that's asked or needed for each strategy and solution that we have.
And I'm Tom Scheibel. I'm a software development manager at Johnson & Johnson. So most of the time I've been focusing on making software applications for people with diabetes and healthcare professionals that treat diabetes, trying to make a world that's simpler and easier for them to manage their disease. And more recently I've been expanding to some other healthcare spaces in global surgery, pharmaceuticals, and behavioral change and chronic disease management.
Cool. I'm Alex. I'm a lead user experience designer at Tonic. Like Bridget said, that kind of goes back and forth from what our roles are day to day, whether that's actual wireframing or designing, kind of transitions in between strategy and stuff like that. So to set it up, first thing I'm going to talk about is just our process and the design process at Tonic, and you'll probably see that it varies from place to place, but overall the pieces are the same. So we'd like to approach a problem in a discovery phase or immersion phase where we start to gather information about what's being asked, what the problem is, what we're trying to solve. The second phase is moving into more of an experience design phase where we start to add a little bit of fidelity and wireframing, sketching, things like that. And then visual design after that, where you start to actually add more fidelity, this thing starts to come to life, prototyping starts to happen. And then there's an execution phase, whether that's actually moving into development, coding things, or really getting things shipped out the door and executing on that. I like to think of it on a higher level as this more of a framework of, in the beginning, the artist, there's an explorer, right? As a designer, you're just gathering all the information and all the raw materials. Then you become an artist, and you're starting to rearrange and play with the information. And after that, you become the judge, and you start to look at all that information and be a little bit more rational, a little more practical and realistic about what you're able to create. And then finally, my favorite mode, warrior mode, you're getting it done, you're executing, you're shipping, you're getting it made. So all those pieces kind of come together in a loop, and it's a lot more fluid than just a stepped process. So that's how we like to interpret it. I'm going to set that up like that. If there are any questions about the design process, that's a really big concept to understand. Is there any questions about that? Okay, cool. So start out. Can you guys tell me a little bit about a time where you've run into some trouble in the design process, either that you encountered with development or maybe you encountered a problem with design? And what happened? What could have been done better? And where do you think you failed or someone else failed? Bridget, do you want to start?
Yeah. So I think some of the problems that I've come into are when there's kind of like a lack of communication or a lack of involvement with both of the teams. So it'd be a project that I was working on. We would spend weeks or certain parts of that process kind of coming up with the strategy and the solution that we really wanted to implement. And then when it got to the point where we were handing it off to development, they were like, wait, this is too much. we can't do this in the amount of time that we have. So one of the things that I started being a little more proactive about is getting a lot closer with the developers, and throughout the process, instead of coming up with a solution then verifying it with them, I verified along the way. I'd ask questions. So if I didn't understand how something was implemented or the parameters that were set, I'd make sure that I understood how it was actually going to be built, because I came into it as a print designer, so it was totally new for me in the beginning. And from there, just involving them in meetings, involving them in the brainstorming and the solution itself was really, really helpful.
Tom, do you have a story?
Sure. So one that I can provide in the diabetes care space, we work a lot with devices themselves and then the wireless communication they do to applications. And usually on the design side, we start with pretty good happy paths of how things are going to work and things like that. But as the program progresses to the iterations and the actual development, start to find that wireless technologies are not always what they're cracked up to be. So I can think of a time too where we were working with insulin pumps and how they would wirelessly communicate to a mobile app. And when we had these nice flows that kind of drew out how interactions happen, we found is that communication is going to drop at times. So you're going to find situations where someone's getting on an airplane and putting their phone in airplane mode. And suddenly these nice, clear, kind of concrete designs, they started to fall apart a little bit because we had to think about the edge cases and the error cases that they tend to happen. And to your question about like where would it have failed or where can it could have been done better, I think sometimes in those cases, like the team has started to rely on style guides or user interaction flows or things like that as a document that's supposed to describe anything, and the team starts to forget about just communicating with each other. So there becomes this need and this necessity to make sure the document's perfect, when the reality is we just need the designers and developers to talk and get to a shared understanding. And it's actually totally okay that it's not written down if you guys both know what you're doing and putting that into the final product.
Whoa. I think it's a little crazy to, and I'll agree with you there, to kind of expect that we're going to be able to document these systems or these things, these moving, modular, living things in a really detailed way. Like, I just don't think we're ever going to get to a point. I think we're getting closer now with a lot of the tools that we're making. We're kind of starting to almost blend as a little bit. But is there anything else you can tell me about the design process from the beginning where you haven't been able to involve development, or how do you like to work with development from the get-go? Do you guys like to inject everybody into the process from the start, or?
I personally like to inject them from the start because I feel like they have expertise and an understanding of a product that I'm never going to have or I'm never going to fully comprehend. So it's great to like involve them every step of the way versus just at the end.
And I can say from the development side, I think the feeling is definitely mutual. You really want to be involved in the initiation and some of the early design and thinking. A lot of times it's actually just nice to kind of feel that you have a say in that and you can provide input into the product that's being created. You're not just the people at the end that are kind of turning the crank and making it all come out the way it's supposed to at the end. But it also does give you a really good, deeper understanding and insight of what you really need to build, what the important parts are, and why sometimes you might look at this one feature at the end and say that's not really necessary. But if you're involved in that design process, you might realize that, well, that's actually needed because A is built upon B, is built upon C, is built upon D, and that B thing is pretty small, but it also wipes out C and D from the board if things don't actually come together and all flow. So it's definitely nice to be able to be involved and see those interdependencies and how the value builds up.
Hearing a lot about communication and collaboration is almost a buzzword at this point in time with the design process and everything that we do. What do you guys do to make sure that you stay in communication and that you actually are collaborating?
I mean, like for me, I actually just like to have a personal relationship with the people that I work with. So I try to not just think of them as, coworkers. They're people that I want to get to know on a personal level. So I know that, maybe Ashley really understands this build a lot better or this language a lot better than Russell does. So I know who to ask those questions to. And by having that personal relationship with them, if I need them to explore an idea for me, then they'll actually go out and be more comfortable, like, giving me what options I have to actually come up with a solution. So there was one time when we had to implement a modal, and I was like, this is a modal on top of a modal, or there's a lot of different segments that they need to be included and it's not going to work. What are some possible native solutions or different ways that we can customize this in order to get this information that the clients requested, kind of get that in there but not have it be blowing up scope. And so she just spent an hour working through that kind of stuff. So.
Yeah, I definitely would build on that too. Personal relationships are key. Having a level of trust in the team and also kind of a level of respect is really, really helpful. Sometimes it takes a little bit of time to actually get to that. And working with people, it is good to think about it not just as work though, as you mentioned, because I think that does create those tighter relationships and that kind of better set of trust in everyone's areas of expertise and things like that. But I think there is a need to really stay connected and avoid the dreaded handoff or throwing things over the wall. It's easy to think of projects in phases of design comes first and then development comes next and then testing comes at the end. But inevitably those products are pretty much doomed to fail from the start or at least be delayed extensively. So trying to involve people in day-to-day conversations, bringing up kind of questions and and clarifications that they come in are definitely key, and helps to build that trust along the way too. But you do have to kind of think about how you stay in constant relationship with your coworkers and partners there.
The dreaded handoff. Sounds like you can get around that if you guys are actually working together and you're aware of all the decisions that are being made along the way. So can you guys talk to me a little bit about these roles that we see in projects? Like I said before, it seems like they're starting to blend together a little bit. We still have our disciplines. But I'll ask a question right now that we could probably spin on forever. As a designer, do you need to be able to code? And as a developer, do you need to be able to design? We're trying to get to shared understanding here.
I would say no. So this has definitely been like a debate and one that I'm kind of in the middle of. So I personally actually enjoy learning how to code. It's something that I do in my free time just because I like thinking that way. But I don't think that it should be like a requirement for a designer to learn how to code. One, because that's your guys' expertise, and if that's such a big magnitude, it's impossible for us to keep up and really stay on your level. We really want to like look to you guys for that, feedback and that collaboration and those expertise and that insight. But I do think that it's really important, maybe not to learn how to code, but to understand what you guys do, how those things are implemented, because then that gives us kind of the restrictions, the parameters, the rules that we need to follow to make your job easier. So if we don't understand what you do or how you do it, it's kind of impossible for us, because especially with design, it's so open-ended. I could, make a pink square and tell you to implement it, but if I don't know how to communicate that to you, or if I don't know how to communicate what I want it to do and why, then it's impossible for you guys to do your job and do it in an efficient and easy way. So.
Yeah, no, I would agree. It's I don't think it's really a necessity. I think it does help to think of it from both sides. So as a developer, think about what the designs are, but also it's great to work with a designer that kind of understands what your limitations or what your constraints might be as a developer to actually go in there. I would say the thing that I would caution against, kind of as a kind of add on to that question, is what you don't want to be is that designer that thinks they know how to code, or that developer that thinks they know how to design. I think we've all probably used the tester diagnostic tool developed by a developer that has like buttons everywhere and input fields that are like 5 characters long, but you need to write like a paragraph in and things like that. So when you're thinking about it, it's good to kind of know where your own expertise and where your own limitations are, and it's always great to kind of extend them and learn more. But when you're working in the team structure, it's good to kind of know where your boundaries are and rely on your other team members and where their expertise is to build that overall final product.
Well, and then to touch back on the whole thing about building trust, like if you are one of those people that you're a designer that thinks they know how to code, or you're a developer that thinks they know how to design, that's actually a way to break trust in your team, because then you're not relying on the other team members and those experts in the room that know what they're doing. They study, they do it on a day-to-day basis. And if you don't value their opinion and want to include them in that solution, it kind of just becomes a one-man show where it gets segmented into those processes where it's like, okay, well, I'm handing this off, now go do your thing. So you want to be able to show that you value other people and what they're doing, and that it's more of like a team, and it's just people with expertise. It's not necessarily a developer and a designer, and they do their own thing.
So how do you get to that moment where the team is kind of flowing together and everyone trusts each other for the experts that they are? Because if you're just put in a room and you start a new project with people you don't know, chances are that I'm not going to trust maybe this thing you said you can do. How do you guys get to that point? I know you said you'd like to treat the people that you work with almost as like friends, and you like to do other things. How do you guys get to the trust moment?
Oh,
That's my job.
I mean, I think that it depends on the project, and it depends on the people that you're working with. If it's someone that I've worked with very frequently, then that moment happens the minute that they're like, hey, you're working with this person on the project. Okay, great, sounds good. And if it's someone that I've never worked with before, that could happen a week later, that could happen a month down the road. But I think for me, it happens when they start to ask me questions or want to know my opinion, or if they're, let's say that I've given them designs or a strategy and they're implementing it and building it, and they come up to me and they're like, I don't understand why this works or how this works. Can you try to explain it to me? Or I have a thought on how this could work better. Why don't we talk through it? Instead of just implementing it or saying no, or telling me why not, they're asking questions or trying to figure out a solution with me. And at that point, that's when it starts to feel like a team. It doesn't feel like an output. It feels like we're trying to actually make something.
Yeah, I think, to kind of take it to the far end, it's actually really cool sometimes if you're a new member to a team and you join and you actually have a difficulty distinguishing what people's individual roles are, because that team has gotten kind of so far into that trust spectrum and that working spectrum that the roles really just don't matter, that everyone's kind of, relying and building upon each other. But, the question of how you get there, I think you actually have to take a few steps back in some directions. Especially at some place like J&J, which tends to be in a constant set of reorganization where you're disassembling teams and reassembling them. That initial assembly is kind of set about with fear of like, how do you define your role and how do you define your area. I actually think that in those situations, it's almost better to rely on those established roles. Who is the designer? Who is the developer? And to some extent, early on, stick within those boundaries. Because those do allow people to kind of establish who they are and where they can help and where they can proceed. And then once people start to feel safe about kind of what their role is in the team, that they're not unneeded, that there's not this great designer that also knows how to go in and code it, so you're just an accessory. Once you get past that point, that's where the trust does start to build. So it's almost counterintuitive, but to get to that point where the roles start to blend, it helps to actually really establish those roles and rely on them early on until the relationships start to form.
Teams over rock stars.
Yeah.
So we talked a little bit about systems and how we're building these things that are always fluid and living and changing. What kind of tools do you guys use to document what you're building? Because I know that we're talking about documentation, maybe we're not getting that detail into it. But what have you found that works for you guys?
Documentation for design can it's like a tree that just has branches that go in every single direction. There's so many different documents. You have content documents, so like you can use Excel docs for matrices, you can use Word docs, you can use almost anything. Then you have wireframes that can be built in almost any program. So the things that I've learned is actually the less programs you use, the better. So one really good one is Sketch, and that's one that I can do wireframes and actual visual designs in, and then that can actually be implemented into Zeppelin and just used for handoff and almost as a replacement for the style guide, which saves me a lot of time and also another program. And then for content, I work really closely with our copywriter, and we usually end up putting it in Excel charts. It just depends on how it needs to be implemented for development. So a lot of times, if it's like a notification strategy, we'll put it in an Excel chart that then they can use as a matrix, and we organize it specifically for what their needs are. But my biggest thing is like the less programs, the better. Because with design, that could be in Photoshop, Sketch, InDesign, and Word, all for one project. And the documentation just builds and piles up, and that's when it gets hard to manage.
Yeah, so you mentioned Sketch and Zeppelin. I think that's definitely one of the more interesting things I've seen over like the last couple of years is how a lot of those design tools and documentation tools have evolved. Photoshop and InDesign and Illustrator, they're great, but when you look at them, you kind of realize they really are for a fairly flat, static document. They're essentially print tools. So some of these newer ones that develop are more developed around the idea of documenting the design or helping to prototype the design for an app. And that really is helpful, especially from the developer kind of downstream side, that there isn't a translation need to go from kind of something that was really meant to make a magazine cover, let's say, to now something that's going to be a fluid app. So it's a great time to really be able to leverage some of those tools and kind of tie into those ecosystems to make that transition less smooth.
So as we're on this journey together through the design process, what's your ideal team, the makeup of that team?
I mean, for me, I think that the more people, the better. There should definitely be technology, like people in the room, and I think that iOS and Android, that's something I've learned. Usually it ends up being like one developer, and a lot of designers tend to design for iOS, but then they completely forget that Android exists. So that's been something that I've actually been working on the past year, like staying closely with Android developers, and while you're working through the solution, making sure that both can be implemented, or how can you adapt these things. And then for design or the creative side, having a visual designer or a user experience designer, but also having someone that's really great with content and understanding how those designs can impact the actual business and client. And then in terms of like client services, I just need someone like a PM to make sure we stay on track, and then an account manager to make sure that the client's needs are communicated, but also that the team's capabilities are communicated back to the client. It's kind of the spectrum.
I do fall on the spectrum of, I think smaller teams are probably the most nimble and the ones at least I enjoy being part of. I know it's probably a buzzword at this point, but the two pizza rule is kind of one of those things of like you shouldn't have a meeting or a team that you can't feed with those two pizzas. Once you get beyond that, you're starting to essentially, fight larger groups in communication and things like that. So, I like to see that 8-person, 7-person team that's really in tune. The other thing that I find really valuable in the team makeup is someone that has personal experience or knowledge or passion for what you're trying to do, especially coming from the diabetes care space. The people that really help you understand what you're doing and help you kind of work out how to prioritize or how to address something, they're the ones that either have diabetes, have kids with diabetes, have parents with diabetes, and they really do have a passion for that. So it's great to have that as a part of the team too. It's not just about the technology, but it's really understanding why you're doing it and just being genuinely happy and excited to be involved in what you're trying to create.
So there's one thing that you could tell the audience to take away from this. We talked about a lot of things. Maybe there's a way for them to be. How should you act on the project? What are the key themes to make sure that things run smoothly throughout the design process?
I mean, my biggest thing would be just to ask questions. So, ask questions, speak up, but don't speak up in the way that you're just saying something to say it. Like, you need to make sure that you're heard by the right people, and also that you're able to listen. And that just comes from, needing to have empathy to understand the other person's perspective, but also be able to communicate your side in a way that they're going to understand. Because without that communication, if people don't understand or you have those miscommunications or misunderstandings, that's when a project kind of falls apart. And things get lost in translation or sucked into that giant black hole that I'm sure we've all seen before. So asking questions and just making sure that you're speaking up and really communicating your needs is really important.
I think communication and asking questions, to build on that, I think the inevitable argument or disagreement is always inevitable. That's just a guarantee on any team you're involved in, but I think they're really well-functioning teams and really good team members find ways and tactics to make sure that those arguments become constructive conversations. I think something to add on to the asking questions is that when you find yourself in those situations, especially if you can kind of take a step back personally, start to ask questions of the other person, but do it to find common ground. I think in almost all situations, if you find that you're at a disagreement with someone else on your team, if you start to ask why they believe that, start to understand what it is and also explain your point, you'll find some piece underneath. You'll find some common ground where you both started with the same facts, and you may just differ in how you interpret it or why that is. And I think having those type of conversations is both enlightening for both sides of it, but also kind of gets you to a point where you both respect ideas. It's not just this person is crazy or dumb or obstinate or anything like that. It's just that generally they follow a different logic path or a different level of understanding to get to their position.
I think those diverse perspectives are really important. When it comes to solving a problem. Definitely you guys are talking a little bit about empathy, which is always important in design. So these are some of our key takeaways that we kind of had an idea of that we might touch on here for you guys. We talked about a lot of different tools. If you have any questions about those things, you can reach out to us either on Twitter or just come find us right now. We're about to open it up to Q&A, so we can do that. But we can make these slides available. Do you guys have any questions about anything we talked about? Let's just keep it free-form.
So I worked on a team previously where we had a designer, we had the developers, and we talk to each other. This is great. Everybody's happy. However,
So you're in the real world.
Yeah, right, exactly. In the real world. What was happening is the designer had the idea of how it's going to work, and the developers had the idea of what you're asking for is a lot to do technically. So it became we want this. We can't do that. We want this. We can't do that. Rather than a conversation. Ultimately, we worked through it eventually, but it was people cutting each other off. It was we don't want to hear that anymore. Like, don't worry about that. How do you deal with that in the world?
So I've actually dealt with that a lot, and it can be not at the fault of the different developers or designers involved, but just the scope of the project. like what the client's need is. Sometimes they think it's this small and it's really this big, and it just makes everyone's head explode. But with that, what I've come to find is that the reason that there's so many disagreements and people are kind of almost halting conversation is because they're so passionate about what they do that they start to introduce emotion into how they're communicating. So this has actually happened to me before, where I was so passionate about the project and I really felt, as a designer, I feel like I need to be an advocate for the user. And so if I'm not speaking up for them, no one will. And in that case, you cross a fine line of, overstepping a boundary of being too emotional or not actually communicating and compromising, and then going back. So the biggest thing for me was trying to, one, break up a project into segments. So if it's a gigantic project, okay, maybe what is the actual MVP of this project? So what do we need to deliver? And then how can we build on that over time that's in more manageable milestones that'll help us get there? And another way was kind of the things I was mentioning before about, okay, I have this task that I need to complete. This is how I wanted to do it, but that's going to take 5 days. Talking with the developer and saying, okay, we can compromise, it still needs to happen, but how can we get it done in 2? And figuring out different ways that you can implement it or different ways you can adapt the design, adapt the strategy to be less, technically demanding would be great. But the biggest thing is compromise. I think it's just about talking, and when you have those emotional standpoints, sometimes just get up and take a walk. Like, it sounds crazy, it really does, but if you're in a room for like an hour and you're just having this heated discussion about like, I need this to happen, well this can't happen, like just be like, okay, we're gonna take a 15-minute break, everyone's gonna go grab a smoothie, and I'm gonna come back and have a nice little chat. And at that point, you almost start to think of it as a new problem. So you don't think about the problem that you solved with the product. You start to think about, okay, this one section is a new problem. How do I solve it? Who are the people that I need to solve it? Is there a different, way that we can implement this that's taking less time? Or is there a different way that I can adapt the designs that still meets the same need, but that it's not going to take you 5 days or 5 years?
Yeah, I'm struggling to add more. The incredible
There's
number
so
and
much.
detail. I would say though that, especially on the take a break thing, I think it's, context, a good night's sleep, things like that can do a lot. So even, beyond the just take a break and let's go right back at it. Sometimes just switching the topic of conversation and things like that. That's a fine line to walk to make sure you're just not avoiding the problem indefinitely. But if there are other things you can move on to start to solve those and start to do that, that can help you kind of get into a better place where there might be proactive conversations as opposed to the back and forth. And you might also find too, as you move to another part of the application or the project, that you start to find solutions there that might shed a different light on where you guys did seem to get roadblocked.
And this is like where it also comes up about why it's so important to introduce development in the beginning, is because when you're developing this strategy, they're going to see those red flags. They're going to see, okay, I have 5 months to build this product, but this is going to take me 7, and it's only 1/5 of the path. And they won't see those things if you just hand it off to them at the end and say, okay, go build it. So having them introduced in that process ahead of time is when you can get those insights, and they're allowed and able to raise the red flags instead of waiting until 2 weeks until the code freeze, and then it's like, oh wait, no, this actually isn't going to happen. Just so you know, it's cut out of scope. So the communication throughout, taking a little breather, I think those are huge things.
How detailed do you get with your designs and your comps? Because I know a lot of times there are clients that I have that get gotta have every edge case displayed. I want to see you when you have the password error. I want to see when the keyboard is up, when the keyboard is down. Actually, which makes sense at some levels.
Yeah.
Sometimes the keyboard covers the login button.
Yeah.
Actually, you have to make that point a lot more than you actually have to. But how like I said, how detailed do you create comps or wireframes for all the scenarios, or do you just create the highlights? Because I always view comps particularly as more concept art than I find as the final product.
So it honestly depends on the client's needs as well as the stage in the project. So if I've had a client where I've done more of these high-level narratives. It's almost like a wireframe, but you're talking about these screens and what they'll do, but it's really just gray boxes on a page. And then there's other ones when it goes into more of the high fidelity, as if I was handing off prompts for someone to build it. That I would get more high fidelity and like really go into detail. Not because I want to create more work for myself, but because that needs to happen. Because a lot of times, you know, you don't need to make it pixel perfect every time because it's going to be recreated in code. The thing that you need to look out for though is sometimes those things like the keyboard goes over the login button. Okay, that's a new problem to solve. So if you don't go into higher fidelity and actually like go through those details, sometimes you miss problems that then in the development stage, you know, those are things that get brought up for other people. But it's really more about, you know, at least the strategy that I try to do, and it'll depend on the app or the website or whatever project we're working on, is making it scalable. So how can I almost create these patterns and these little elements that I create in high detail, and then you take those little elements and then just implement them or put them in different places and like put it together as like a piece of a puzzle. I don't know if that answers your question.
Do you, kind of a side question?
Yeah.
When you have a client that requires a web presence as well, a cross-platform basically. They want an Android app, they want a web app, they want the iOS app, and of course it has to be the iPad and the iPhone.
Yeah.
How much of your time is spent creating all these sort of wireframes and comps and designs, along with the fact that you have to worry about the interaction components of them?
Yeah, it can be a lot of time, and sometimes that's actually very underestimated by, you know, account and development alike, sometimes even design, because you can get a problem and think that it'll take you 3 weeks and then start solving it and realize, wow, this is gonna take me like 5. But the problem with going cross-platform, and that's why like I'm saying like patterns and scalable elements are really key, is because when you go cross-platform, the minute that you design something for 3 different devices or 3 different things, if you make one change, you then have to make it across all 3 of those things. So your time almost triples. And that's something that's usually not thought about a lot, because for development, it's kind of like, okay, I'm making the iOS app, I make that change once because I'm only worrying about this one platform. Whereas with, you know, like design, I'm thinking about every platform, how do they connect? How does Android translate into iOS and translate into a desktop app? And all those things kind of, they have to mesh. So if there's a bit of feedback or one little thing that changes, it can actually just change over time. And that's kind of one of the key things that Tom mentioned, you know, about communicating instead of documenting every little change, just making sure that everyone understands what those changes are and what needs to be done is sometimes a lot easier than someone spending hours changing something from blue to purple, you know. So it would just depend on the change and whether it's an actual like new problem to solve, or just something that can be implemented with communication between design and development.
From the other thing I had too, from practice and experiencing and going through this a few times, I worry less about the differences in Android and iOS. I think there's really good established guidelines on both the Google side and the iOS side that kind of help you through what those interactions should be. And especially people that are experienced on those platforms kind of know what they are and can use those to fill in some of the gaps. The one that usually gets us is like the expanding it out to tablets, because inevitably if you don't actually show what that design is, you either get the UI magnified 5 times, these gigantic buttons everywhere, or you just get a bunch of white space or blue space or whatever the background is, kind of, you know, hiding things. So that's the one I tend to, you know, try and have the teams focus on, because that's the one that there isn't quite as complete existing standards to say this is the right way to do it.
What helps us a lot is read the human interface guidelines, read the material design guidelines,
Yeah.
and if we get it for free, we better have a really good reason you're coming into a comp that doesn't use that. It just saves time and being aware of what those patterns are. They're established, they're there. These devices have been out for a while. If you're not going to do something that's commonly used, it could be really awesome. It could be really cool.
Yeah. Well, it's also stuff too, if you don't understand them. So this has happened before, like, you know, I originally came in as a print designer, so I had and I'm an iOS user. Android was completely new to me. And we designed an app that was mostly designed for iOS. And then I had to take it and translate it to Android. And I was like, I am completely clueless. I have no idea what these changes need to be. So I sat down with an Android developer and I said, of this app, basically did an audit of the entire thing. I was like, of this app, what are the things that will not work? And we just circled them. And then from there, I did my research, and then each little element came up with a new problem to solve. But now when I'm going through, it takes me less time to adapt those things because I'm thinking about, okay, if I have a bottom nav on this, I can't have a segment view controller at the top because then I need this to turn into like almost a tab system for Android, and those two things will mix. So if you have those things in mind, that's what I was kind of saying before, like you don't need to know how to code, but you do need to understand how things work, or else you're gonna basically be adding more time to your work. You work smarter, not harder. It's kind of the biggest thing. It's like the smarter decisions that you can make early on, the better off you're gonna be.
That's actually one of the things you illustrated there, I think, is, that's a really good attribute of a team member I like to have on my team, is someone that's willing to kind of step out of their own preferences. So sometimes it can be really difficult to work with a fanatical Android user or iOS user because they're so kind of instilled in why their platform is better. So it is really helpful, to work with people too and kind of to step aside from what you're used to and make sure you kind of immerse yourself in the platform you're trying to target.
Sure.
I don't know if either any of you really have much of this experience, but do you, like, at my company, there's a third party in this conversation that isn't here at the table right now and is never at the table for almost anything, QA. They're at the end, they're doing at least some manual testing and trying to compare like an image to the actual, what we actually implemented. Like we do a fair amount of informal stuff between, design and development, so like we're generally mostly on the same page. How do you help that third group out? Do you have that?
Well, at Tonic, we actually try to introduce QA in the beginning. Like, so kickoff meetings, I know that they are actually introduced. They have a plan for how they want to test different things. And then I've actually had times where, for certain products, I've sat down and almost have like a design QA. And QA is brought in, and I sit with them, and I go through the app, and if it's like a design audit, is this type right? Is this color right? I'm not only going through and helping them kind of pass or fail different tickets, I'm also like helping them kind of by explaining what this product does, what are the patterns that are created, and what they should be looking for. Because a lot of times if you can help introduce them, it kind of like development, if you just help introduce them into the product by showing them designs earlier on versus just handing off a product when it's built, it kind of helps them be a little more aware and like well-rounded when they're going into their actual tests of like understanding the different things to look for or how to play around with the app or different things like that.
Yeah, I think, in the ideal world, it doesn't really exist. You want your QA people to be kind of side by side with you and understand exactly what's there. And then there's the real world where inevitably the QA team kind of has moved from project to project to QA what's ready at the final piece, or they're offshore and it's a difficult geographic barrier to manage and things like that. I can say from, the diabetes care and medical device space, one thing that I think we find really valuable is that QA team is testing to something, whether it's requirements or designs and things like that. And giving a prioritization to them can really help focus what their area is and where the value is. So we call it CTQs, or critical quality, and enumerating a set of requirements, because we usually do that in our medical device world, physically write out shall requirement statements. Having a certain classification that's critical to quality helps them focus on the parts that the user's really going to get value from, and not the, the bottom right pixel is the slight wrong shade of red or orange or whatever it is, because kind of left to their own, they know just to match up the specs, and we'll tell you every place where the spec doesn't actually match.
So speaking of, not, QA certainly was missing from the table. Another one that is in this team.
Seat's right there.
Yeah. The other part of the team dynamic, you guys really didn't mention, is project management. So like, to the extent of, when you guys are in projects, do you just, do you tend to just talk to the developer or your other peers, or do you have to include project management, and, how do you use that to your advantage?
I mean, I like to have a close relationship with them in terms of communicating what I'm doing, when it's expected to be done, what they expect from me. Because I think that the biggest struggles is when you don't communicate. They're making promises. They're the ones that communicate with the client. So they're making the promises of what you're going to execute. And if you don't have, a very clear communication with them about what they should expect, what actually is going to be done, what is a red flag, then there's no way that they can communicate that to the client and help you out. So there's been times where, if you just say, okay, well, this needs to be done by Friday, I'll just get it done by Friday, but it's really something that's going to take you till next Wednesday, and you don't raise that red flag, then it's not really helping anybody. Whereas if their job is to help you manage the project, help manage client expectations, and to set a schedule. And so the more that they can understand what you do, how long it takes, what you need, the better they can help you.
So I can kind of put J&J spin on that too. I think the project managers that we have that are really successful either wear two hats or two separate project managers. One is focused on the team and helping the team progress and understand where they are and where they need to prioritize. But J&J has layers upon layers upon layers upon layers of management. Shocking, right? And you can talk for days about sprints and burn downs and why things are on track and product backlogs, and it just flies right by their head. So sometimes you actually do need a project manager too to kind of take what the team is experiencing and where they're at and translate that in a way that people that are kind of like, well, I just know I have a product launch on this date and I need to know what to expect. So they're also really helpful in shielding the team to kind of stay focused on what they are and not get people that are kind of not directly involved in the project getting things messy.
I'll get a little closer to make it easier. So as savvy design consumers and creators, what has influenced you most in terms of apps and resources, and where do you think the exciting new territory is in design?
Awesome question.
Great, that's hard.
She wants to do your job. Drop the mic.
Hand the Post-it notes over.
Because I have these interesting conversations as a developer where people say like, well, I want this to feel like Facebook. And like those big apps have kind of, I think, really obvious influence, but what are the subtle influences? Maybe that's not.
Are you speaking from like a product point of view or an actual visual design interaction point of view?
I'll take whatever you guys find appealing. Tell me what's next and what's influential now.
I mean, I think that like AI, like stuff like that, when you can make things that are smarter, because at least something that I've been seeing is that there's a lot of apps. You can probably find an app for almost anything. At this point, nothing's really fully new. But what people are looking for is a way to take off cognitive load of what the tasks that they need to accomplish. So ways that designers and developers and just smart people can work together and take these products and make something that not only is smart on its own, but is smart incorporating the user into that experience. So learning who that user is, learning what they need and how they can help it and evolve with the person, that's what's going to create these experiences that are really sustainable and not just one that's kind of like, okay, this is great for a month and then I'm going to delete it to make room for this new app that I found. Because the more that the app can grow with the person, I think that's going to be something that really takes it to a new level more than just one that's got 1 million downloads and looks great.
The other thing I'd say, I guess, on that was probably coming at it from a slightly different angle, but specifically from the design and how we interact with things. I look less to the apps themselves, like iOS and Android kind of establish a pattern for you to follow, to a lesser extent, but there's still something there. So I look to those as kind of more like perfection and refinement of how things are supposed to be done. But I find kind of the most interesting kind of design shifts and things like that coming from the hardware themselves, like the tangible part or kind of what you're interacting with actually needs to change or kind of introduce a new way of being able to interact or work with it. And then on top of that, that's where people start to innovate and leverage. So, the new buzzword, not even that new anymore, is like Internet of Things, and you kind of touched about this of how things are pervasive, but kind of looking more to that end of where things start to change and where the early trends start to emerge.
Yeah, the VR stuff is really fun. We have a couple of cardboard things hanging around in our office. They're pretty great. We've done some work with that. But I think when phone came out, 2006, right? So it hasn't been that long, but in that time it was, we can make an app for everything, and the market became super saturated. We made all these things that we didn't need. It was just cool to see if we could make an app for it. And from a design point of view, it was skeuomorphic, and it had shadows and bevels, and it was real, and you could touch it. And I'm really happy in what's happening now, where things are just getting stripped away. It's like, actually, do you need to make this number one? We're being a little bit more intentional. And also, I think we're moving away from the interface, which is might be putting myself out of a job. I don't know, in like 5 years, but less is more, and the interface is kind of disappearing. You can get just to the heart of the service of what the user is doing. It might not be a button anymore. It might not be a grid. The things that we're starting to see are just getting so embedded in the user's life. That's exciting.
Yeah. There's an interesting take I've seen on the design stuff too. This is a little bit to the side. But like, you know, as you mentioned, like things used to be skeuomorphic, or you'd have drop shadows and you'd have buttons and things like that, and things are becoming much more flat. At least one of the things that I've kind of read up on there is that's actually people becoming more in tune with the devices. So you have those things in the past as kind of your metaphor, your analogy of like what that real world thing is you're interacting. But as people become more and more kind of in tune with phones or voice recognition or virtual reality and things like that, they stop needing those kind of hints of what it is like in the real world, and those things start to become interfaces on their own that mean certain things.
I mean, the people that are being born today, the real digital natives, have you ever seen a baby pick up an iPad? They can use it, and they'll like play with it and figure it out. It's terrifying. But I'm really interested to see, what does an interface look like for that person that's born today? It probably looks nothing like what we're doing right now, because they don't need those metaphors.
Like that phone icon is going to be lost on them because they'll never have a phone with like a receiver.
Yeah, that's a Susan Kara icon set that was done for Mac, with like the floppy drive, save, all those things are just, they don't mean anything. Sorry.
Just question curious.
You guys have any other questions? Sure.
So how do you handle things, so like a few years back when Facebook had like the wall or whatever, it had that, I don't know what it's called at the top, the banner, the picture up there, and everybody like lost their minds, like I want to go back to the old Facebook. So how do you handle incremental updates like that so users don't get upset?
You have to kind of like show them value in it.
Okay.
So it's kind of, the reason that they usually freak out is probably because they've created a habit to what you've already given them. And so when things change, people are like, I have to do something new now, I can't do something new. So if you show them the value that there is to invest in that, then that's when they start to kind of create new habits or go into a different flow. So like for the wall and stuff, like that's something small, but it's like really related to like a lot of user, I guess, interactions or the things that they respond to are all based in psychology. So the things that provide them their needs, and for a lot of people, those things can be stuff like connection to others, just validation, like different things like that. If you can provide those values and then use that in order to kind of push them to invest in it, that's when they start to almost go into like this feedback loop of constantly or consistently using a product and almost creating, like Facebook, most people will check that every single day. I think I spend more time on Facebook than I really should, honestly. But the whole reason for it, you don't even think about it after a while because it's become so ingrained in what you do and you start to get that validation without really realizing it, and that's when that habit is kind of formed.
Okay.
The other thing I'd say too, just kind of try and track as many analytics and kind of behaviors as you can. So, you know, change for the change's sake is always bad, but sometimes you just have a very local minority. So understanding like who's actually adopting it, and maybe 90% of the people are doing that silently and are actually pretty happy with it. They're not going to come and pat them on the back and say great change, but it's a 10% that really didn't like it, that they're the ones screaming, and it's good to actually understand, especially through tracking of usage, who you have there.
And with that too, though, you have to be really open to the fact that sometimes change isn't good.
Yeah.
So like when you make a change, so for the wall, like they could change that tomorrow and everyone would freak out. But that's almost the idea and why things like user testing is so important, is because sometimes the solutions that you make are based off of assumption. You think that the user needs this based off of the things that you've seen, the things that you've analyzed, or what the solution that you've created that you think is great. But if the users don't use it or they don't respond to it well, it's because maybe you've actually assumed the wrong need and the wrong solution. So those are things that, wow, yes, usually it's the 10%, it's the squeaky wheel that you usually hear. And sometimes it does take time to kind of catch on to new trends or different changes. Like there's also times when you have to listen and pay attention and be like, okay, well, if solution A didn't work, maybe this other solution is actually what they're really asking for. And a lot of times with those needs or those pain points that you find, you figure out what the user's needs actually are or a better solution. You just have to be willing to listen.
So on a practical question to the very same point, we've now proven that there does need to be a change and we've implemented it, but how do you sell it to me? Now I'm your long-term user. How are you going to sell me that change is actually beneficial to me?
I think it would depend on what that change is,
Okay.
and also the experience. So that was
It's
kind
big,
of,
it's big enough that you're gonna piss me off. If I really don't like it, and I'm gonna become your squeaky wheel. But I've been a very happy customer, 5 stars for, versions 1 through 6, and now version 7 is really changing something on it.
I think that the change is kind of what I was saying is like providing that value. So when I'm
Sell that to me.
yeah,
How do you
so
sell that?
well, when I'm creating an experience, if I'm changing something, I can't just like change it and then expect the user to understand and go with it. So that's where things like onboarding or even if you're asking, so things like notifications, usually a lot of times if you have a modal or a message just kind of explaining the benefit of notifications before you just ask for permission, it catches on a lot better or a lot faster. It's just like a proven thing. So that's kind of like where that would be, is that you use onboarding, you use messaging, you use different touch points or moments of impact with that user during that experience in order to introduce this new change and kind of set the tone for it versus them just kind of coming onto the app or the product and then being like, wait, what the heck is this? I've never seen this before. Because at that point, then it's something that it's so new to them that it's almost like you didn't even give them a warning. And I think that's probably when the fury comes out a little more fun.
We can keep talking. I know we're probably over, and we'll hang out for a little bit if you guys have more questions. I don't know if anyone has to leave or get up and they don't feel like being rude. We'll give you guys an opportunity to do that now, but we can keep talking if you want. Anybody else have any other questions? We'll hang out for a few minutes.
I could add one more thing to that too, which is to leverage your early adopters. So to use the Facebook example, I think my initial reaction when I saw, okay, there's a second profile picture is like, great, I have to go find but then you actually saw like some people start to actually do things and kind of clever things with design and how they position them and how they use like the second picture, like the scope of them to composite it. And sometimes you can actually use your early adopters that are willing to adopt and really use that change as a way to model the behavior of the value for the larger piece, especially in the social setting.
To add to that, coming from a product that was in the market for 40 years and then bringing it up to speed. So you have a lot of customers who've been doing it the same way for 40 years. If there's nothing wrong with the way I do it, why are you trying to make a change? And what is successful is bringing in, especially the long-time customers, the people who are using it every day, day in, day out. What are your needs? And actually, as it comes out, usually a lot of times what they're doing is not what they need anymore. With the way it used to work, and it could work much better this way, but bringing them in and very early in the process, even in the design phase. And then, constant releases out, hey, here's what's coming. By the way, it's coming.
Big
Next
flag.
week. Oh, it'll be tomorrow. Just that constant awareness is definitely helpful. And you still
That's always.
I asked them what they wanted.
But bring them in and getting their input in the process, because now they have ownership in the product that comes out because they had a stake in it. And you show that you value them as customers, you show that you want their input, you show that you want their feedback on what you're doing, and you listen and give them at least something else of what they need.
And it's great too to like include them in that process, because if you think about it from the user's perspective, like sometimes they might not know what they need until you ask them about it. So if you sit someone down and you're just kind of like, okay, so for diabetes management, you could sit someone down and just be like, what do you need? They would have to actually sit there and think about their day-to-day process and their management and all the different touch points that an app or a website or something could help them with. And a lot of times that's just not a thought that people would have normally. They would just go about their normal routine. So by interjecting those questions or introducing them into that process, you're kind of changing their thought process or introducing new elements to it that can kind of create that change and create those solutions.
So I feel like that's something we didn't mention here, but like observing users actually using it. In the diabetes space of the medical device, where we have to do human factors testing to actually validate and show safety, which a lot of times actually involves you sitting behind that one-way mirror watching people try to use your application. And bridging that gap between designers and developers, just having people watch that and kind of experience the frustration and things like that, I think really hits home, and you forget about all the other conversations and theoretical whys you have, and you get very much to the heart of like, what is easy to use, what isn't, what's difficult to understand.
I think as a developer, one of my biggest most impactful experiences was when I was out training the end user of a product I just worked really, really hard on. And he's literally, he said, "Come follow me. This is what I do to do my job. You just made my life harder." And that's extremely eye-opening to see. Oh, that's what it is. So even just putting a button on two different, you have to go 3 pages in to get to it. It's a big deal.
That's why like user testing is so great, and sometimes I think that it can actually be an ignored portion of the process. But doing that before time is spent on development, before you actually build something, you can just use prototyping tools. I can string a couple screens that I've already made together. You put it in front of someone and just ask them, okay, use this, does this help you? And they're gonna tell you all the things that you need to fix before it gets built, and then you have to go through another process of basically starting from scratch. So introducing those things where you're really making sure that everyone on the team is a user advocate throughout the entire process until that product is shipped and actually helping someone is really important.
So question for you guys, flipping it back around, how many people in this room have attended a user research session where they've watched a user use something they've made? Super fun. It's the funniest thing ever. It just makes you feel, it just humbles you a great deal. I would recommend everybody do that. It's the funniest thing.
It's the best part, like the confused look on their faces.
Yeah, it's just like it's very easy to lose sight of what you're actually doing. You need to include this stuff in your process. All right.
I want to give a quick promo for next month's talk, since it seems like we're wrapping up.
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay, so next month, I'm going to talk about a mythical creature called the full stack engineer. And we have a fantastic speaker. His name is Mauricio Linares. If you've been to other talks in the area, you've heard him speak really sort of intelligently about a number of things. So he is definitely qualified to talk on this mythical creature, but he's going to debunk it and move us away from unicorns and 10x developers into real practical skills. And also sort of understanding the market when you are job hunting and you see that we want a full stack engineer and the list of requirements is 18 years worth of Rust experience, things that just don't quite line up with reality. So I think it's going to be an awesome talk. I hope to see you there.
All right, thanks.